Hi, I'm Justin. This is C5 Dev, where inspiration is a chain reaction. In this video, we're going to be looking at unit tests in the docker-polyglot-world repository. You can find the link in the description below. This is what the repository looks like on the website. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to be looking at the testing section. So with that, I'm going to switch over to VS Code. We're in VS Code. Have the repository loaded on my workstation. I'm going to go down to the testing section, just like before. First language we're going to look at, as usual, is Python. And just like the video on dev containers, I'm going to open up a dev container using the Python image for this testing. And to start up that dev container, I'm going to go back up here and grab the command that I used again in the previous video. And I'm going to put that into my terminal. All right, and then I'm going to run docker ps. And you can see that the Python container is now running. I'm going to switch back to VS Code, attach to that container. That opens up a second VS Code instance, and so that is running right now. If you don't know about dev containers or how to use them, or are confused by the commands that I'm running, I do encourage you to check out the previous video that I made about dev containers using docker-polyglot-world. Okay, with that VS Code instance up and running, just going to double check that I am editing on it. Perfect. All right, and then going to move back to the README and go down to the testing section. And so for these tests, I want to change directory into Python and then run this command to make sure that I have the requirements. And then I will run pytest. So we're going to cd into Python. Now that we're there, make sure that I have the requirements local. The reason for that, let's just open that up. You can see that this brings in the requirements. We're going to be using pytest and some of the dependencies that it has, and then there's also a Python formatter. The other thing I will need is the regular requirements file as well, because that actually has my web framework as well as then the HTTP server that's going to run that. So I'm going to go to requirements and install that. All right, now I should be able to run pytest. And there we go. So we have 6 passed, and you may be asking, well, where are the tests? So if we open up test main, and I'll minimize terminal, here are the tests that we are running. And the tests that we're doing is just making sure that we get a 200 code. We're also doing this app debug test. And then we're also doing a mock test. So we're actually swapping out here the get host name that is a part of the application. So let me open up main.py. And inside here, you can see that we have this command that actually gets the host name, and that's what we use. So what we're doing is mocking out that, which means kind of replacing the get host name function with our own function, and that is going to return this test host, so we're testing that. And kind of the big driver of why we want to mock out that function is that we actually want to simulate throwing an exception during that process and make sure that we get a 500 status code when that exception occurs. All right, so then one of the things I want to show is that if we modify this, so I change that. Now this one is going to be looking for hellos. And you can see right there, now hello does not match hellos. And you can see that we have a failure now on that test. I'm not sure why this ellipsis is in here and why it actually starts with 1D9, but the key is that it points out that it is actually this failure is on this row. So we can fix that. Now the actual issue would actually be in main.py. So for instance, if I change this to hellos and then run the test, now you can see a whole bunch of the tests are failing. So we go back in, Fix that, run the test, and we're good. And another part just to show, so this one is actually checking for this to fail because it raises an exception. So we change this to a 200 status code and then run the test. This will fail. And there we go. It's expecting to have the 500 internal server error, but it's actually getting a success. So I'll change that back. So this is a pretty simple setup for Python tests. I just want to get started something to show the initial pattern using PyTest for our Python application. That way you would have something to run and to build from. Now, if you wanted to write your own Python test, you could copy this example and start from there if you're doing a web server. But one way that I want to show you, which is actually what I did to set up this initial structure and to kind of get the start on it, was actually using a tool called ChatGPT, created by OpenAI. And so I want to show you what I did and how I kind of used that tool in order to build out these initial tests for this application. In my browser, I'm at chat.openai.com, and that's where you can use ChatGPT. Some of you are probably pretty familiar with this tool, but wanted to just kind of show you some of the examples of what I did. So what I did here was ask GPT to create a unit test for my following Python app. It's a pretty simple app, so I was hoping that it would kind of give me a good starting place. You can see its response, pretty useful, but it is using the unit tests framework, and I wanted to use PyTest. Just below that, I said use PyTest instead of unit test, and it complied and made the conversion for me. And so if we go back over to my test_main, you can see that it looks a lot like that. I did add in the get host name and components like that. Also, one part here, this is an important part that after working with it, I realized, so I didn't give it a name for the application that I was creating. So it said from app, but mine is actually from main because my file is called main.py. So from that, you can see here, I told ChatGPT I was receiving an error, a module, no module named app. And then that's where, upon looking at that a little bit more, found out that I should have called that main. For the next part, I wanted it to help me write a test for the 500 response due to hostname raising exception. And that's where it added this component for me. You can see right here, this app.getHostname. That again is just like the import up here. I'm actually at main. And so down here, main.getHostname. From there, I refined it a little bit more and asked it to rewrite my main application so that way the 500 error will raise an exception. So what I actually found out is that by writing this test is that I was not getting a status code of 500 because of the way that my main application is written. So then I asked GPT to see if it could just rewrite that for me, put it into a try block, accept, and it'll return a status code, a generic response with a status code of 500 internal server error. So pretty helpful. Just like in my previous video, dev containers, I was explaining that I use another OpenAI product called GitHub Copilot, and I use it more for just kind of suggestions in my code. Same thing with ChatGPT. You want to use it just to kind of guide you in the right direction, but it's going to make mistakes. It's going to have issues. Don't rely on it for perfect code. ChatGPT can be quite helpful. I used it for the different implementations of Hello World. I did that because I'm not that familiar with all 6 languages. And I also just wanted to see what ChatGPT could do to help get me kick-started on each of those. The next one up is the Go implementation. Before I look at the Go test implementation, I do want to make a small amendment to my previous video on one of the commands I said. In the dev containers video, I said you could use the docker kill command to stop the container. The kill command will actually send a signal kill to the application, the container itself, whereas the docker stop command will actually run the sig terminate command. The docker stop with the sig term is going to give it a little bit more grace for it to shut down. And you can see right there, it takes longer. So let me start that back up. And if I kill that container, it's going to stop it immediately. But in most cases, we only use the docker stop command because it'll have a more graceful termination than if we kill it. All right, going to grab that go container command, back to my terminal, check docker ps, perfect. Going to attach to that. That starts up another instance of VS Code. Going to go back to the README in the testing section and check out Go. All right, so we're going to cd into the Go directory and then run go test. Open up terminal. And then go test. All right, that one's pretty simple. Let's open up main_test. There's a few tests here. First one we're going to take a look at is handler returned the wrong status code. So it's actually right here. This is, if you hover over, you can see that it's supposed to be at 200. So that one is checking for that. It's also down here. It's checking for the body to equal what we expect. And if not, it's going to raise that error. Then we also have a not found, meaning that this is a path that doesn't exist. And if we hover over here, it's looking for a 404 status code. And then we also have the internal server error, 500. Now the way that we're creating the 500 error is actually up here. So we're going to be mocking or overriding the OS hostname variable with this function, and it's going to return this error. And so just to test that, I'm going to go over to main go. I'm going to change the body, change this to hellos. And when I run that, I have a fail, and it points right at main test go on 37, expected this body, or expected this to equal this. You can see that that's not correct. We'll go back in and fix that. I can also change this is really any path that I haven't implemented. So I even change that to test, and that should pass. All right, and same with the Python one. I used ChatGPT to give me an initial structure for my test file. So I provided it the main application that I have, and then it provided this back. Which in this case, it provided me the whole file that you saw. And this is interesting because this test status internal server error was actually a check that I wasn't thinking about, is that this OS hostname function could provide an exception, and we would need to handle that. Now we're going to switch over to the Node.js implementation. Going to go back up and grab that Node.js command. Going to run that in my terminal. Looks like I already have that container, so I can actually just start that one up. And I'm going to switch here and start Node.js. There we go. Check docker ps. Perfect. Have that running now. Switch back to VS Code. Going to attach to the container. Node.js. New instance of VS Code. All right, going to look at the README and go to Node.js section. All right, so cd into the Node.js directory and then run yarn test. All right, going to cd into that directory and then run the yarn test. Some passing tests there, that's always a good sign. Let's take a look at app test and server test. The reason that there are two tests in this one is that I actually split this application into two. So there was just originally the server.js and I created the app.js. So that is being imported here. The issue I was running into is that otherwise trying to run this test, it was running into this app listen. So this one is more of an integration test because we are using the server component itself and actually hosting this application and running it. But the test I want to focus on more so is the app test, because this is actually the unit test piece. And you can see here's a familiar component. So that hostname mock, similar to what we were doing in the Go implementation, is needing to mock out that hostname. So that way we can test that exception in the 500 status code. But similar to Python and the Go implementations, making sure that the object returns the values that we want, and then also making sure that we get that 500 error. As you can see, if I change this to hellos and run that test again, we'll get a failure there. And so there's that failure. Just going to move up. So hello, to have a property of hellos. And so it points right there. I'll fix that. And then also down here, I'm going to change this just to show that we can fail this as well. So if I set that to 200 and run the test, scroll up. And so you can see here, we expected it to get a 500. Nope. And we expected it to get a 200 because that's what I changed the test to, but we actually received a 500. And similar to the previous ones, I also used ChatGPT to give me the initial template for this. And I'll briefly show you kind of some of the things that I worked through to get that to work. In ChatGPT for the Node.js unit test, I put in the app.js file. And so I don't have the server piece in there. And it returned and gave me pretty much what you saw. One thing is that it implemented it with Mocha and Chai. It's also pulling in super test, but I kept that one. All right, asked it how to run the test, tells me which dependencies I needed. It doesn't know that I was using yarn instead of npm, so I just made the switch on my side. The next thing is I was first wanting to look at using Mocha instead of Jest. So I had a previous test that was using Jest, and I wanted to see what that looked like. So it actually converted it over for me, which was pretty helpful. But then after looking at Mocha and having some issues as I was trying to run this code, I decided that I wanted to actually go back to using Jest and asked it to switch out the previous Mocha Chai for Jest. And down here, it made the switch for me. And then I also asked it how to mock out the OS name. And so that started to provide me some hints as to what to use there. Even asking it as I get errors, how I can handle those and what they mean. So pretty helpful. Combining this with OpenAI's GitHub Copilot along with Google searching kind of just helps you get a test in place. Right about here is where it started to get me, after I asked a few more questions, provide me with how it can do this Jest spy on, and started looking at the Jest docs to just kind of understand that function a little bit more. So I made sure it was doing what I expected it to. One of the important things is this is just kind of a launching off point. You can also ask it questions and make sure you go back to the documentation and make sure that it's implementing exactly what you want it to. All right, the next test we're going to run is the Rust test. So I'm going to grab that command. In my terminal, I'm going to run that. Cool. Docker ps. And we have Rust there. Perfect. Going to attach to that container. All right, with that Rust dev container up and running, going to go back to the README. And go down to the testing. Find Rust. All right, so we want to cd into Rust hello world and then run cargo test. All right, going to go into Rust hello world. Cool. And then cargo test. All right, and then we have one passed and then one ignored. The reason that this one is ignored and this one's okay is that this is actually an integration test down here. Now, Rust, in order to have integration tests, it's actually going to be in this test folder. So I just kept it here for maybe a future implementation, but we're not using it right now because of that ignore. Unit tests is actually going to be written in the file with the application code. Rust has a private public type view model on it. And so items in the file are private by default. And so for security, we're just going to have our tests included in this file. This configuration line tells Cargo that this should only be used in tests. So that way, when we do a cargo run or a cargo build, it will not add this code into the application. All right, you can see here we have just a simple checking the contents of this. I did not implement the exception in the 500 code on this one, and so that may be a future implementation. Change that to hellos, and if I run cargo test again, we'll get the failure. All right, perfect. Caught just what we expected. I'll switch that back. When I was using ChatGPT to help me write the Rust unit test, my ignorance of writing tests in Rust, or even really working with Rust very much to begin with, I didn't realize that there was that public-private view visibility modifier. So I did go to the Rust docs and start to look and read about Rust testing and how to use that. And that's where I found out that for unit tests, you want to embed them into the file that you're actually writing the tests for. In this case, it probably would have been easier for me to go directly to documentation and figure out a little bit more about testing and then go to ChatGPT, but it still worked out pretty well. All right, the next one we're going to look at is Dino. So let me go and grab that command. All right, Dino is actually already running, so I'm just going to use that docker start and start up Dino. Going to attach that container with the Dino dev container up and running. I'm going to go down to the testing section and find out what we need to do. So we're going to change directory into the Dino directory and then run Dino test allow sys. All right, that ran really fast. I'd already run this before, so I think it was available on there. Let's take a look at controller test. I wasn't too familiar with Dino prior to creating this application, so it was an interesting lesson. So it was an interesting thing to learn from. This one is similar to the Node.js tests, where first we check the contents of the body, and then we also run a mock for the get hostname and test that that gets swapped out, and then also do a check with that same mock, have a function that actually throws a new error, and make sure that we get a 500 on that. For Dino, I also used ChatGPT. This one was a little bit harder, actually, than the previous languages using with ChatGPT. My assumptions for it was that Dino is a little bit newer, and also because it is newer or a younger language, that it may have gone through more API changes. And so the things that ChatGPT knows about it is less. So not too much to go into on that one with Dino. Covered some of the main parts. I do like the hints that VS Code gives you with the Dino extension. So that's pretty cool. With that, let's switch over to Crystal as the final implementation. And with Crystal, I know that this is already on my machine, so I'm just going to start that up. All right, going to do docker start and get Crystal going here. All right. Going to attach to the Crystal container. Okay, with the dev container up and running, going to open up the README. Going to open up the README and go down to the testing section. Let's figure out what we need to do. Run Crystal, all right, Crystal directory, and then run this Crystal spec. What's interesting about Crystal is that they actually use these specifications instead of like tests. So that's something unique for me. I think if you've used Ruby before, that may be something borrowed from that language, but I'm not sure. In that directory, you're going to run the Crystal spec. This is the star is, or this asterisk is a wildcard. So let's just check and bring those files. Finish, and you can see that it says examples. So just a little bit different language. This one was a bit interesting for me. We're going to go into the specification file. So this file is actually pulling in that request handler. I actually found out that I need to split out my Hello World app into two pieces. So I wanted this request handler on its own, and then also have this server running here. When I'm doing that unit test, I want to focus on just the code that is in that specific function. So I extracted that, and then that's what lets me run these tests. One of the unique things for me with working with Crystal is kind of this server response. I was trying to use the context response status code, and that worked fine, but then there is no context response body, and instead you actually have to do this IO component and rewind it and then check it. So that part was interesting, but I'll change it right here. I'll just change this to hellos, and then we can run the test again. And so there you can see that it did fail what it expected and what we actually got. So I'll go back and change hellos to hello. So I tried using ChatGPT to write the Crystal test. It gave me some of the structure, but I ended up needing to rewrite a significant portion of it. Some of the reasons I think that, again, Crystal, kind of like Dino, is a newer language. Crystal was actually tougher than Dino for me to figure out, even though it was the last implementation I did. I think I'm just not too familiar with that paradigm, that kind of structure. It's more along Ruby, and I haven't worked with Ruby before. One of the other things about Crystal is that when I was doing a Google search to help me figure out some of the components that I needed, I had to make sure to type crystal-lang to get the crystal lang. Otherwise, it would look at Wikipedia for crystals and crystal-related things, and that's not what I needed. Put a link to a pull request in the Inspired By section in the docker-polyglot-world repo. And that is pointing to where another developer wanted to write an abstraction layer around the body component that I showed earlier to make that easier to use. But it looks like that pull request isn't going to be getting accepted. So that's just the way that it works. That said, this is my first time using Crystal. I'm not sure if I'll reach for it for another implementation. I think some of the other languages that I showed before are going to be a lot more useful for me. But it's a part of the repo, and I got to experience something new, so that was pretty fun. That's all 6 implementations that are currently in Docker Polyglot World. I recommend that you download the repository and give those tests a try. Maybe try adding your own tests into the implementation of your choosing. In the future, I'm going to add how to contribute to the repository, so that way you could actually add tests and make those a part of the Docker Polyglot World project. If you liked this video or found it helpful, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this in the future. And follow me on Twitter for updates. The link to my account is in the description below. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.